I'm Lisa Shepard, and I am the Executive Director of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. The mission of the CJCP is to enhance professionalism among North Carolina lawyers, judges, and law students, a mission which it has been doing since 1998. One of the ways that the CJCP does this is to sponsor this historical video series, which is a collection of video interviews of distinguished lawyers, judges, and professionals from across North Carolina. The CJCP began filming these video interviews in 2000 as a means to preserve the thoughts of these bar leaders on the legal profession and on professionalism issues. All of the videos in this series are available to you on the CJCP website and the CJCP's dedicated YouTube channel. We are so fortunate to have had many distinguished members of the North Carolina Bar over the years, and they have much accumulated wisdom to share with us. It is important to understand that the practice of law is a profession, and doing it well requires not only substantive knowledge that one gains in law school and from studying for the bar exam, but also the value of experience learned from other lawyers. I hope that this video series will give you not only a fresh insight into the person being interviewed, but also some meaningful information about how to be a better lawyer in your own practice. Enjoy, and remember, esse quam videri. Strive to be professional in all that you do, rather than to merely seem so.
We are today in the North Carolina Bar Association Center and in the H. Grady Barnhill Conference Room. We're here to recognize and honor Grady Barnhill. He will be recognized as a recipient of the Chief Justice's Professionalism Award for 2016-2017. Here to speak about Grady are two of his great friends, former Chief Justice Burley Mitchell and Keith Vaughn, the managing partner of Womble Carlisle. These two gentlemen knew Grady, perhaps better than many of us, but we all knew and loved Grady for what he was as a wonderful lawyer and a wonderful person. So I'm glad you can be with us today.
Chief, we're here to talk about Grady Barnhill, whom we have both known for a number of years. I've known him my entire professional career because he was my mentor, but you've known him even longer than that. So maybe it's appropriate for you to start this discussion.
Well, Grady, and I don't mean it facetiously, was everybody's mentor. You know, he gave me advice, solicited and unsolicited, my entire career. I'm not that much younger than he, but I am younger. And even after I became Chief Justice, Grady would call me, or more frequently, I would call him and say, you know, what do you think about this? Some new program I wanted to put in, and that sort of. And he was particularly helpful in how the lawyers would react. As you know, Grady was a lawyer's lawyer, and so many people went to him for advice, and sometimes I accuse him of being an old maid because he would get agitated about something that might never happen. You know, I mean, the man could. I never saw a problem come up with litigation or anything I worked with him on that he hadn't anticipated and prepared you for. So sometimes it was really aggravating because he was slowing me down. But when we got into the actual whatever it was, law case or policy matter, I was glad he had done it.
He could not get partway into anything. Once you had him involved, you had him totally involved.
Right.
Even though he was working on 100 different things at the same time, when he turned his attention to your matter, he was all in. He was thinking about every possibility that might arise, and he was constantly rethinking the strategy. Any number of times when I was working with him on cases, we would stay up till all hours of the night working on a strategy and finally conclude that we had the strategy. And I would come to see him the next morning, maybe before the trial was to start or some other event. And Grady had been up for 2 hours rethinking the strategy and had a new plan that we had to talk through. And sometimes we went back to the old plan, and sometimes we went with a new plan or some modification. But he was always thinking about that matter and what strategy was the best. And there were no boxes around a particular strategy. He would throw down those walls, build new boxes, think about new approaches, sometimes things that none of us had ever even dreamed about in terms of how to handle a situation. Very creative and agile mind.
He was really just a wonderful example for all of us of the kind of humility that a lawyer should have. Very unassuming and low-key, and in both his personal relationships as well as legal ones.
And it was genuine.
Yeah.
It was not something that was just some facade that he acted out in front of people. He would genuinely liked people. He respected their positions, from the bailiffs in the courtroom to the court clerk to the court reporter, all the way up to the judge. And as I alluded to before, he was my mentor for over 40 years. And one of the first things he ever taught me was, your best friends are other lawyers. And he lived that way.
Yeah.
He valued other lawyers. He would fight like crazy with them in the courtroom. But once that was over, they were good buddies. And he was always there for them and for the judges and anyone else who needed some assistance.
He truly was that term, a lawyer's lawyer. Fit Grady Barnhill as well as any, or better, I think, than any lawyer I've ever known.
He was a very competitive person also. And he loved the competition in court and outside of court. And any time he could turn anything into a competitive exercise, he was all about that.
Yeah.
And I recall remarking to him at one point, golly, Grady, this was when I was a young lawyer, you must have unbelievable stress in your life with all the things that you're handling and all the competitions you're involved in. And he responded, Keith, I don't feel any stress because I thoroughly enjoy what I'm doing.
He did.
Every minute of every day, he was a happy warrior.
Yep.
And just all involved in everything he was doing. And the competitive aspects of it just drove it.
Yeah. He, I think that's a good point. He absolutely loved what he was doing. And I always tell young lawyers now, you need to love your work. If you don't, you really need to do something else. Because as you say, there's apparently so much stress involved. But if you're doing something you really love, it's not work at all. And I think Grady embodied that. He was just an all-round good, competent, and kind human being. He really was a fantastic example for me, and I know for you and so many other lawyers.
When Grady passed away a few years ago, there were some email exchanges among senior prominent lawyers in North Carolina that I had the good fortune of seeing come across my email screen. And at one end of the spectrum was a lawyer in Winston-Salem who had practiced more than 45 years with Grady, not in the same firm, but in dealing with lots of different kinds of litigation. And his statement was that in all of those 45 years, he did not believe he had ever seen any person who was a better friend to other lawyers than Grady Barnhill.
Right.
And at the other end of the spectrum was a lawyer who said when he had just started practicing, he was in a case with Grady, and that Grady treated him with tremendous respect, would pat him on the back at the end of a day, tell him he'd done a good job, even though they were on opposing sides of the matter. He just understood what lawyers were thinking and going through and wanted to help them in the course of their careers. Grady enjoyed teasing people, and he enjoyed being teased.
Yeah.
He just wanted to be involved in anything that involved good humor.
Right.
He was constantly up to something to keep things lively and entertaining, and we all miss that.
Yeah, certainly do.
With Grady, you never knew what to expect in any proceeding. I will always remember, and I've been practicing law since 1975. But I will always remember the first week of my practice because I was working with Grady, as I did for a lot of years after that, and I had never been to a deposition. And Grady said, "Come on, I'm going over to Greensboro. There's a deposition going on. The best lawyers in Greensboro are involved in it. We've got a witness we're defending, and time for you to learn how a deposition works." So I was glad to go along. I made perhaps some comment about, "Well, Grady, you've given me a couple things to do, so I hope you understand if I'm going over there, I can't do those matters." And he said, "Do those at night." And that was just kind of the way we operated for a lot of years. But I went with him, and I watched this deposition, and lawyers were going after each other like crazy. Question would be asked, there'd be an objection, there'd be colloquy back and forth, and it would go on. And about noon, the Forsyth County trial calendar had broken down, and Grady's case had been called for trial even though it had been 10th that morning. So his secretary called and said, "Grady, you've got to get back over here and select a jury at 2 o'clock. And he said, "Okay, I'm on my way." And he looked at me and he said, "You take over this deposition." And I said, "Grady, you know that I've never been to one of these before." He said, "I know, but you watched it this morning." And I said, "What do you do? What do I do if I think something's wrong in a question and I feel like I should object?" He said, "Well, you say objection." And I said, "Well, Grady, I've watched what occurs this morning, and people frequently will say, 'Well, what's the basis of that objection?'" And he looked back at me and he smiled, and I promise you he had a twinkle in his eye. And he said, you look them straight in the eye and you say, "I am not here to give a lecture on the rules of evidence. I'm just putting you on notice that there's something wrong with the form of your question." And as I've said on another occasion, at that point in my career, the theoretical and the practical merged, because that's what Grady was all about, was taking the theory and putting it into practice and using it as a shield or as a weapon to advance his client's cause. And he was extremely adept. Another instance I recall was going to court with him in federal court. And we had some lawyers from New York down who were primarily handling the case, but we were local counsel, and with Grady, it quickly morphed from local counsel to having a major role in the proceedings. And he was introducing the New York counsel to the federal judge, and as only Grady can do. Grady could do. He said, "Your Honor, these fellows are from a New York firm. They're extremely bright. They're Yankees, but I've talked to them, Judge, and they understand now the rules about how we operate down here, and they're going to be just fine. And actually, they're pretty good people too." And the judge, of course, smiled and looked back and said, "I'll take your word for that, Mr. Barnhill, and I know that you'll keep everything in line," and smiled. And I couldn't help but think that those New York lawyers were looking at each other thinking, "My golly, what have we gotten ourselves into?" That was their first thought. And their second thought was, "We need to stay pretty close to this guy because he may be necessary to get us out of trouble at some point in these proceedings." But he would take any situation and make it something a little bit different that others had not expected.
When I was on the Court of Appeals, the intermediate court, I was still pretty young, probably too young, and Grady would come down, and all of the senior judges paid him great deference, and it took me a little while to assess why. It wasn't just political contributions or influence, that sort of thing, but it's because it's a very simple thing that some lawyers never get a hold of. You could count on what he said as being accurate, and when I was on the Supreme Court and as Chief Justice, it was even more pronounced in some of the big cases that you were involved in, Keith. When Grady made a statement of fact, I don't think any of us ever went and checked behind it. The law clerks may have, but we just knew it was accurate. And I'm happy to say he passed that on to folks like you and John Garou and and some of the others there who appeared fairly regularly before us, it just, his ethics just sort of infused the Womble firm with a credibility that most firms didn't have. I mean, you know, and we got some fantastic firms in this state, but it's just, and that I guess had come down from the very beginnings of the firm, the Wombles and so on. But Grady was a person that you absolutely knew first would be truthful, but just as important, would know what he was talking about. He would know his facts and would convey them to you accurately. And that is a reputation that every lawyer ought to strive for. And he really embodied it, that total professionalism.
Well, picking up on that same point, I recall being a little surprised early in my career when I would go to a hearing with Grady, and I guess I was surprised the first time this happened. That I went to this hearing with Grady, and the judge asked him a question. Said, "Now, Grady, is the law such and such and such and such?" And Grady paused for a second, looked back up, and said, "Well, Your Honor, as an advocate, I would say so and so. But if I stepped away from my role as advocate, I would have to acknowledge that you pretty accurately summarize what the law is." And I think the judge appreciated that. Sure. And then Grady would go on and advocate even more his view of the case and how the law applied to it. But he did not try to mislead the court because I think, consistent with what you're saying, he understood that in the long term, his clients were much better served if the court knew that he was not going to take advantage.
Absolutely. You know, Grady grasped what many lawyers go through a career without figuring out, and that is the good judges are looking to you as the advocate to help them get it right, and they are genuinely, the good judges are genuinely seeking essentially advice or counsel from you, and he never abused that, and you could always count on him to give you good advice.
Grady took over a courtroom. When he was trying a case, he was the most colorful person there, not in an unattractive way, but in an exciting way. When he selected the jury, he would move his chair out from around the table and sit and talk to the jurors one-on-one with respect to questions and push back gently to make sure they understood what it meant to be fair when difficult issues would come up. He would, from time to time, just take over a plaintiff's, when we were representing defendants, take over a plaintiff's table because it was closer to the jury and sprawl out on the table and have a doctor come down and conduct some medical examination to illustrate to the jury what he had done in that particular situation with the plaintiff. Surprisingly, not many people objected to that, and I'm not sure the judges would have sustained the objection anyway because everybody wanted to know what he was going to do next. And the stories were numerous about, you know, putting dirt on the floor and then getting down and talking to the dirt as being the true indicator of truth in this matter, because that dirt showed where the debris was on the highway and which side of the road that the accident had to have happened on. But he would do things in a very colorful fashion, totally command the courtroom, and in the final analysis, he could win or he could lose. But the jury always understood what Grady's point was. Mm-hmm. They were never left without a full understanding of what he was trying to convey. As I think back on my 40 years with Grady Barnhill, I see a person who was a colorful and dynamic part of the lives of everyone at Womble Carlisle. He could have done a lot of different things in his life. He was extremely intelligent. He picked up on facts and law quickly. He had a keen understanding of human nature. He loved people. He was competitive. And he had a way of just taking over a situation, accepting responsibility for it, and then undertaking to solve the problem, whatever it was, in a way that few people could. And I think probably a fitting summary for his life is that he was always there when we needed him. And that's a pretty telling and impressive epitaph for a lawyer, or for that matter, for any human being.
I saw Grady from a little distance and wasn't as day to day as intimately familiar with his working. So what I got was an overall impression, I think, that, as we've said, of being totally competent, highly skilled lawyer, and one who did it the right way. And I frequently gave him what I think is as good a compliment as you can give anybody when I was talking to lawyers. And I would say, if you want to see how to behave in a courtroom, how to react in a courtroom, study Grady Barnhill, because I have never known him, and this is the truth, I have never known him to make a miscue or a misstep professionally. He was a highly intelligent individual, one I think of great emotion, although he didn't reveal it a lot. He had deep love of people, love of his family, love of other lawyers, and was really in his proper niche in the world, where right up until the last conversation I had with him, he was worrying about me and my problems and the firm, and he lived every day of his life trying to make things a little better, which is about all that any human being can strive to achieve.